Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast. I'm your host, Paul Rader. As you can see, it's another special edition of the show because we have another guest. But before we get to her, just whether you are new to this podcast or not, I always make note in guest episodes that I don't take a specific stance for or against anybody's political views or any groups they belong to. But that being said, today's guest has a lot of experience and interesting takes with today's topic, and that topic is open primaries. Primary elections are how we come up with the candidates that run in the general election, who we then choose from to ultimately win an elected office. And many of these states use closed primaries where only Democrats can vote in Democratic primaries and only Republicans can vote in Republican primaries. But in New Mexico, the state government just enacted legislation to open up primaries to where independents can start participating in them. And our special guest today played a major role in making that happen. Her name is Sila Avcil. Sila co-founded and serves as the executive director of New Mexico Voters First and is also the executive director of New Mexico Open Elections. Previously, she was a national organizer with open primaries, and on the educational side, she earned a BA in International Studies and MA in Political Science, both from the University of New Mexico. So she's New Mexico through and through. Sila is here today to talk all things open primaries, current and future. So, please welcome to the show, Sila Avcil. Sila, thank you so much for being here and taking the time to talk to me today. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks once again for coming on. So, I think it only makes sense to start from the very beginning. How did you get involved with this whole endeavor of getting open primaries implemented in New Mexico?
Well, no story is ever short enough, but I'll tell you. So, as you mentioned, I have a master's in political science from the University of New Mexico, and because of my international background, I was always interested in studying international relations and comparative politics. But through my program, I was required to take two classes outside of my research field. So I was like, let's just take some classes in American politics, public policy. Let's see what that's all about. And Paul, I have to tell you, I fell in love with American politics. I thought it was incredibly intriguing. It's so different from any other, political system that I've observed around the country, around the world. And so I was very interested in learning more about it. But immediately after graduating with my master's, I got a job in another local nonprofit, which is technically where I got connected to this field because the founder of New Mexico Open Elections is also the honorary consul for Germany. And so, because of his international background and my international background, we connected. And he was like, "Hey, Sila, I'm looking for a young executive director for this group that I founded. Do you happen to know anyone?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do. It's me." And so we started working together in 2022. I had no idea what I was fully signing up for. I had an idea of like, oh, we're doing public education of election reforms, but I had no idea what that meant and like what it entailed and what I was about to do this year. Um, and so the more I learned, the more I became even more intrigued, and I served as the expert witness for our bill in 2023 at the 60-day legislative session. And then in 2024, we had drafted a bill, but New Mexico's legislative process is incredibly tedious. So every other year we have a 60-day, and every other year we have a 30-day legislative session. And in every 30-day session, you can only introduce things that are, you know, big in budget, that's going to affect the state in terms of finances, or if they're constitutional amendments. And we really didn't want this to be a constitutional amendment because the New Mexico Constitution doesn't need to be amended for open primaries to be enacted. The current Constitution allows for that. But it would have given us, an easier access to the shorter sessions. Anyways, we didn't get a message from the governor, which is another way that you can introduce bills in a 30-day session in New Mexico. We didn't get that, but we knew she was supportive. She just didn't want to prioritize this bill that year. And so 2025, we were like, okay, that's our golden year. We're not doing anything in the 30 day and 24, but we're gonna work right now all the way until next session so that we will get this done in 2025. And so here we are now.
Wow, yeah, and you're talking about just getting drawn into, just how the whole American system of government functions and works. That's the big thing that really, drew me into it, was just trying to figure out how it all works. And with your international background, I do find fascination in looking at how other countries do it too, but it's definitely not my forte. And I'm glad that you brought up about, a little bit about that legislative process, because we are going to get into that in a little bit, but a little bit more on the history of the closed primary system in New Mexico. Has it always been a closed primary system since there's been primaries? Did they previously have any other kind of open primaries, or has it effectively always been a closed primary system in New Mexico?
So, New Mexico as a state was founded with closed primaries, which back when we were founded, these conversations weren't really a thing about like reform and democracy and access. And so we have always been a closed primary state. We do have neighboring states that have been always open primary states. And we also have neighboring states that have gone from closed to semi-open and are exploring fully open, um, such as Colorado and Arizona. And so it's been really interesting, again, to like learn about these processes and American politics, as to like which states were founded with fully closed primaries, which states were founded with semi-open, and etc. And so, but New Mexico was always closed, and New Mexico Open Elections was working since 2015, so 10 years this year, on getting something passed and getting the public educated about, like, hey, there are alternatives and we could change the law.
Okay, interesting, fascinating. Yeah, because I want to say is what 1911, I think, is when New Mexico became a state. I've been doing a side project I've been working on is just basically the partisan history of all the states, and uh, delves a little bit into New Mexico's. I think every state's partisan history is fascinating to some degree, but a little bit more obviously about the closed primary system, even though uh, now that it's changed in New Mexico. In your own words, because can hear what some people say about the closed primary system in general, but I'd rather just hear it straight from you. In your own words, describe what is wrong with the closed primary system. What are the issues that you've seen arisen from it, and why did it need to be changed?
That's a great question, Paul. I think first and foremost, closed primaries are taxation without representation, because primary elections are funded by taxpayer dollars. And if you're saying that, oh, we'll take your taxes to pay for these elections, but then you don't get to vote in them unless you become a member of a party, when those parties aren't the ones paying for these elections to take place. And so I think that's number one, first and foremost, that every taxpayer should have equal access to every taxpayer funded election without having to go through added barriers, which are also additionally costly. Because in New Mexico, before this law, we had same day registration. We still have it, but the main purpose of same day registration is for voters who aren't registered to register so that they can vote. But in New Mexico, that process became, if you're an independent, then you can use same day to become a member of a party, and then you can vote in that party's primary, and then you can go home and change your registration again. And we really saw that this was becoming burdensome, and it wasn't as seamless as elected officials were making it to be, because as the ED of these two organizations for the past 3 years, I've been contacted multiple times by independents saying, hey, Sila, I tried to use the same day process, but it took me 6 months to re register as an independent. And if that is an option provided to voters, that should never be taken away and never be a burden that takes 6 months long to become who you want to be as a registered voter again. And so it's really, really about making the process easier and more accessible to people. And in particular, young voters in New Mexico and all around the nation are more and more registering as independent voters because, I mean, I don't know why, because I'm, not, I don't read everyone's mind, but most of them, their reason for that is that they grew up with their families fighting during Thanksgiving dinner about politics. And so they really don't want to get involved in that because they see it as a negative factor in their lives. And so they register as independent, which I think in and of itself is a political statement saying that they don't want to be part of a club, but they still want their voices to be heard because they still want to participate in the process. And so for me personally, being a younger person who has a lot of friends my age that are independent voters, it was personal to me too that closed primaries prevented my friends from participating in the most consequential elections that determine the winners of many districts in our state and in the country. So many, many reasons, but
Yeah, I want to say, if correct me if I'm wrong, it was something like a quarter of the electorate in New Mexico is registered as independent.
yes.
Yeah, so that's a pretty decent sized chunk. It's here I'm in Florida, and it's something like 34%. But you a lot of states you see something like about a quarter of the electorate, or even like a third, or even I think Massachusetts actually has like over half that are
Wow.
registered as independents. And actually, I had another guest a few weeks ago talk a bit about some of the reasons that independents register as such too. But back to the arguments for and against, or for the arguments that you made the case for open primaries, but obviously closed primary advocates have their own arguments that they make too, whether they're, obviously for those listening, you can decide for yourself how valid they are. But one of the major arguments that closed primary advocates give is that party members should have the right to choose their nominees that represent them. They'll often cite the First Amendment right to assembly as one of their main arguments and say, other party members or independents coming into their primaries is it's not letting them come to make their own decisions for their own groups. So as an open primary advocate, how do you respond to that argument in particular?
Well, Paul, being at the legislature for 60 days straight gave me many exposures and experiences to all the arguments that exist above the ground. And honestly, like to the First Amendment argument, um, it's also in the Constitution that every citizen gets the right to vote. And so that's my counter argument, and every taxpayer should be able to participate in every tax funded election. And so that's like my favorite counterpoint to that. And then that like gets people thinking like, oh, that's correct. Um, but also, like I was saying earlier, because these are taxpayer funded and not funded by the parties, and the parties have every single right to fund their own elections. Um, but because they're not funded by the parties themselves and they're funded by the people, and this government is by the people for the people, then all the people should be able to participate regardless of how they're registered, as long as they only get to vote in one primary of one party. Again, unless it's a fully open primary, and that's a whole other rabbit hole that we can get into. But under the semi open system, the party ballots are still separate, and any voter that is not registered with a party can just go and pick whichever party's ballot they would like to choose that year. Um, and so hopefully, this helps more people understand that like this is really not a party issue, it's a voter issue, and it's an access issue, and it's a democracy and participation issue. And also parties still have the right to hold their pre-primary conventions and pick their candidates that way and keep it within the party that way. But these people at the end of the day don't represent parties, they represent districts of the people that elected them. And I think that was a huge argument for us at the legislature, is that you're not here representing the Democratic Party of New Mexico or the Republican Party of New Mexico. You are here representing District XYZ because that's who elected you to be here today. And I think that's just the most important thing that we continue to say to people when they bring these arguments up.
Gotcha. So you just talked about how you've seen basically all the arguments that closed primary advocates make, which obviously makes sense to you since you were so ingrained in the legislative process. What are a couple of the other common arguments? Well, maybe just one or two, or if you want to give more than that, that's fine. But one or two of the other common arguments you've heard from closed primary advocates, and what you and your team had in response to those.
I think one of my favorite ones, because it's just funny, is that why don't independents just start their own party and run their own candidates in the primary? And the whole point of being independent is that so you don't do that. There's plenty of third parties and minor parties that people have the choice of being involved in, but the point is that a majority of these people don't choose to affiliate with any of these parties, not just the major parties. And so that one's always fun because it's like, have you read the law? Do you know that running an independent candidacy is ridiculously hard compared to being part of any other party? Um, in New Mexico, independent candidates have to collect like 10,000 more signatures in a given district, depending on what they're running for. So it's really almost impossible. Um, and then the second favorite argument that I heard a lot was, what if all these people start voting and then they start voting for the bad people that we don't want, and then they raid all of our primaries? And it's like, guys, these people don't vote. The whole point and the whole problem is that they don't vote, and we want them to vote, and they want to vote too. And so when you give someone the chance to vote, they're not going to go and be malicious. We have to trust our voters and our people in our state that they're going to vote their conscience and for the people that they actually like. And there's so much data showing that most people who vote don't vote strategically. They vote for the candidates that they actually like, because it's such a gamble that you're throwing. And even the most organized effort of strategic voting in the state of California was incredibly unsuccessful. And so we see strategic voting happening more often in a closed primary, which is not even significant levels, but it's 1.8% of the time. But under any form of open primary, it's 1.2% of the time. And so this change makes it even better for strategic voting to not happen as often as it already does.
Yeah, with the whole voting bad candidates, I feel like you can anybody can make that argument for general elections too. Sometimes people just vote for people that you don't like. Uh, and with the ballot access, I was reminds me of a book I had self published a few years ago. But basically just how onerous ballot access can be for candidates who are not with one of the two major parties, and whether a lot of times they don't. I mean, I'm sure I don't know exactly how New Mexico's works, but I'm sure you've seen it before. Is just how either they don't have the option to pay to get on the ballot, and they have to get a certain number of signature ballot or petition signatures to put them on the ballot, and then a lot of times they need a much higher amount than Democrats or Republicans do. But it's kind of like that whole, well, if you don't like something, why don't you just do this? It's like, well, you make it sound like that's an easy thing to do. It's not necessarily an easy thing to do. Whether it should be done or not, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. But let's change gears here a little bit. So just to make things clear, because there are several different types of more open primaries, and just for people listening at home, and even for myself, uh, is the change that you were a part of in New Mexico. So it's just anybody who does not have a party can participate in either Democrat or Republican primaries, but it's not. Democrats still have to vote in Democratic primaries, and then Republicans still have to vote in Republican primaries. Is that correct? Okay. So since we established that non-party voters can choose either party's primary, were you hoping to have a primary where anybody of any party could go into either primary, or was it this just focused on independence?
So cross-party voting is unconstitutional. So that part is fair and true. If I'm a registered Democrat, I cannot go and vote in the Republican primary. What is not unconstitutional, so what is constitutional is if there's not separate ballots for each party and every candidate is on one ballot, which we call open primaries and jungle primaries, then you can vote for any candidate as any registered voter or however you're registered. And then because you see every candidate on the same ballot, so you could be like, I want this Republican, I want this Green Party, I want this Libertarian, and so on and so forth. Um, Under the system that we have passed, the two ballots are still separate for each major party. And in fact, Libertarian Party used to be a major party in the state of New Mexico. I believe they recently lost their major party status here. So the law only affects independent, non-affiliated registered voters to be able to pick only one ballot of one party and then vote. Originally, the bill had included minor party and third party voters as well because they don't have technically primaries. But we also found that that could be a challenge constitutionally. Going back to your First Amendment argument, is that they are already choosing to affiliate with a party, regardless of what party that is. And so, and they sometimes host conventions if they have candidates on that are live going somewhere. And so that having them not having to change their registration and be able to vote in another party's primary was what was the argument that was made. And so we had to amend our bill to remove all references to minor and third party voters. But I'm sure it's different in every state, just as everything is in every state. But in New Mexico, third parties don't have status under the Secretary of State. So if you're, let's say, a Working Families Party member in New Mexico, you're technically registered as an independent, as an unaffiliated voter. But it's like
Okay.
a drop down addition when you're selecting your registration. And so we got a little backlash from our local minor parties about that, about them being excluded from the process, which is totally fair. Um, but at the end of the day, when we looked at the numbers, people registered with a minor party in New Mexico were only 12,000 people compared to 300,000 people that were registered independent. So the bill still did so much more than we ever could have imagined by passing and getting signed and restoring voting rights for so many people that didn't want to vote by becoming a member of another club. But yeah, so it doesn't include minor third party or cross party voting.
Gotcha. So I guess that was kind of part of the whole calculus. You were just talking about how you wanted this specifically to be legislation, not a constitutional amendment, because then obviously there's a whole other rigmarole you have to go through there. But I guess that's because you went with the legislation route, you kind of had to you were basically forced to exclude third parties. Then, so am I understanding that correctly? Then,
Yeah, just for the purpose of not being challenged if the bill did get passed, because as you can see, there are so many challenges to any form of open primary across the country right now. And so we really wanted to be super duper safe with the bill that we knew was going to pass and hopefully get signed, which it did. And so we believe that if it had included minor parties as a signed bill, then it would have been challenged in the courts, and we probably would have lost because of the constitutional affiliation rights.
got you. Yeah, obviously you're trying to include as many people as possible, but minor parties do have such really in every state there is such a small proportion of them. But that's a good segue into this next question. So forget exactly the state constitutional provisions for New Mexico. Is the new primary system you have, is that the one you most wanted to see? So is there a different type of primary you find ideal where those third parties could also become part of uh or be able to choose whichever major party primary they want, or even that Democrats and Republicans can choose whichever primary. Is there one of those that you specifically want to see? Do you think that this is the ideal way to do it, the way it's being done right now, or do you not have any particular preference as long as it is not a closed primary?
Definitely the last one. And
Right.
I think that because, closed primaries are not good for participation, for representation. And I think that every state is special. And we believe that semi open was the best form of primary for New Mexico. We know that, California, Texas, other states have fully open primaries, which work for them. And we really don't have that much competition, anyways, in our elections. And so the main point was just to get more people involved in the voting process, in the electoral process, and hoping that in and of itself leads to more representation with more representative people being elected into office. And, I think any form of open primary is great. It just depends on which state you're in and what the appetite is in that state. And if there's more competition, if there's constantly people running all the time, then obviously something more like a fully open or a ranked choice model would work better. But our population is so small in our state. I believe we have more cows than people in the state.
Oh, wow.
Someone needs to fact check me on that. But so, there's no point in having a bigger or, different model than what we have just passed. And I think it's going to take a little bit of time for us to implement this, anyways, and to get people to know their new rights, that they can just vote as they are and they don't have to change their registration. And so that's going to take enough time in and of itself and hopefully lead to more representation for New Mexico.
Was that also then part of the calculation too? Not just obviously having to account for what the state constitution says, but just trying to do almost like a baby step kind of thing. You didn't want it. Was it really just, hey, we don't want to go, get too far reaching right now anyways, we're just trying to, you know build our way to get there? Was that part of the calculation too, or were we really just focused on right now, we're just trying to get anything that's not a closed primary system?
Basically, so for like I said, for the past 10 years, New Mexico Open Elections was introducing bills at the legislative session, and they had introduced various types of primary systems. They had introduced ranked choice voting. So we saw how our elected officials were responding to each bill and the interest levels and the support levels. So all of that was put into a calculation when we decided that semi open was the bill, and that was the bill that was going to pass, because none of the other forms of primaries had any support from the public. They didn't really get it. But when you said independents should be able to vote, it clicked automatically. And so that made so much more sense. And like you said, people call it a baby step, but for us, it's a huge step for humanity, and our democracy. And being the only second state to be able to pass this through a legislature is just
Oh,
huge for our
interesting.
history. And so, because most states that changed their electoral process changed it through a ballot initiative. And so it's Maine and then us. We're the only two that have been able to get this through a legislature, and convincing party elected officials basically to say, hey, you guys should invite independents to the table, was probably our biggest challenge, because some of these are like old school Democrats, old school Republicans that just don't want to change the way that they have been elected for the past 20 years. And then there's a handful of newer, younger elected officials that were like, no, I see the problem. I know that we need to change this and this will make everything better. And so there was a lot of interesting dynamics there. And once you have a bill that is like supported by partisan but also opposed by partisan, to me that's when you know you have a good bill.
I got excuse me, I got you there. A little bit before we get to the because I did want to get to, you touched a little bit on it, the actual legislative process. Do you, so you're you are talking about primaries being more competitive, and even though I don't officially take sides on most things, I do think that we have a very serious problem with political competition in general, or rather lack thereof. And there is, whether we do closed primaries, open primaries, whatever, there is a very serious issue we have with a lack of competition in politics. So you are talking about primaries being more competitive, and so do you ultimately feel like this will lead to more competitive general elections as well because of more people being involved in the primary process, or is that even not, or were you just mostly just focused on, look, we just want the representation in the primary, general election, whatever happens kind of thing? How do you see it in that regard?
So there's a study from Unite America that shows 80% of congressional seats are decided in the primary because the districts are so gerrymandered to favor one party over another. And I believe New Mexico has recently redistricted because when I first got involved, my state senator was somebody else, and then they literally districted him out. So he didn't even get like not reelected. He just got
Oh
kicked out
wow.
of his own
Yeah.
district. And I mean, he was personally ready to resign and like retire, so I guess it worked out for him. But I would be like going to town halls and shaking hands and be like, "Oh, you're my senator. Nice to meet you." And they'd be like, "No, I'm not. I'm not your senator anymore. Where do you live?" And so that was
Oh
really
wow.
interesting to see. So, because of how these districts are drawn and how like that all goes down and works, because in New Mexico we don't have an independent redistricting commission. Our districts are drawn by basically the legislators and people that they appoint to like go through this process, and then they have to account for all the tribes and pueblos that we have in New Mexico. We have 23 federally recognized sovereign nations, and we have 19 pueblos in the entire state. So we have probably one of the most highest indigenous populations in the country. So they also get included in the process to make sure that everything looks good and that they approve it. And this process doesn't happen often. I know it just happened somewhat recently, but it doesn't happen often. It was challenged multiple times, but it's how it is now. And so I don't think it would create, the bill that we just passed would create any changes to like districts or competitiveness in those districts between parties. But I think it might create some form of competitiveness in primaries, because, like you said, more people are going to be participating. And these candidates who are not used to talking to more people than just the top 3% voters in their districts, they're going to have to be talking to everybody now. Um, which is, in my opinion, what every candidate should be doing, anyways, rather than trying to get out the vote of 3 people that already vote to vote for them. Now they have to talk to those people and the independents and the other people in their party and everybody that will have a say in that primary. And so it's going to be very interesting to see what the outcome is going to be, because the next time we're going to use this system, which is going to be the first time we're going to use this system, is going to be the 2026 primaries for the state, where a handful of state representatives are going to be up for reelection. Our governor is up for election. We're going to have a primary um, for a few other seats, I believe. I don't have a full list in front of me, but so the governor's race is what everyone is paying attention to right now, because there's a progressive Democrat, and the first Indigenous person to hold the office of Secretary of Interior for the Biden administration is running for governor. And then our district attorney is also running for governor. So there's like a little divide of progressive versus kind of moderate Democrat happening right now. So this primary should be very interesting to see who the voters, especially the independents, favor.
Right. And because Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, she's term limited, right?
Correct.
Okay, gotcha. Um, so, obviously, because she was involved, because she had to sign the bill, Let's get a little bit into the actual legislative process. And this is actually kind of multiple questions in one. So just to make this easier to go through, I'll just focus on one specific piece. So let's let listeners peer under the hood a little bit, so to speak, at the finer workings of this process because you were so heavily involved in getting this bill passed. So give me some sense of, and we'll try to hopefully get back to some of the previous instances that you tried to get a bill passed and it wasn't quite as successful, just to compare to today. But first, let's look at the successful uh, venture this time around. So, how difficult was it to get this bill passed? I know you talked a little bit about it with the whole 60-day and 30-day legislation. So, just a little bit more in depth about how difficult it was to get this bill passed.
It was This year was not as difficult as previous years because we were so prepared. We had an entire strategy. We knew exactly which committees we were going to. We knew exactly which votes we needed because we had a previous floor vote from the Senate from previous years. That was extremely helpful to have unsuccessful sessions in the past, to have that data and look at it and say, okay, like the top 5 people voted yes, we need these 3 people to vote yes, and so on and so forth. So like strategically, this session was actually pretty easy. The hardest part of any legislative session is being patient, because this is New Mexico. We call it the land of mañana, which means the land of tomorrow. So you have to sit there and wait until tomorrow comes, and then the smallest little update comes to you and you're like, great, I can work with that. And so it's very patience oriented, and like you have to know the right people, you have to have connections. It's very, very connections oriented. So for us to be able to hire a lobbyist that was full time there with me every single day, who had connections that I didn't. And then when he didn't have the relationships, and that I could just step in and fill in the gaps. So that was incredibly important. Plus, we had worked for the past year and a half to build a coalition of organizations. So it wasn't just a New Mexico open elections issue, it was an entire like community issue that we all cared about. And we had diverse voices there. We had veterans groups, we had young people, we had NM Native Vote, we had the Asian American Family Center for New Mexico, and everybody pitched in as much as they could, and that just made a huge, huge difference.
Gotcha. So actually, you kind of just went into a little bit of the next question that I was just going to ask is how did the alliances and opposition stack up a little bit more like any other particular groups that might have stood out besides like those veteran groups or the Pueblo villages that you were talking about, um, actual elected officials? Was it a pretty bipartisan push then, or what? Was there also a bipartisan pushback? Was it mostly one party, or any particular or there are legislative leaders that led opposition or alliance with it? Walk me a little bit through more of some of like the particular uh, prominent players in elected office, whether they were allied with your movement or against it.
In terms of our allies, we were again super strategic with who we wanted on our coalition as our sponsors. We wanted leadership, in particularly from the Senate, to hop on board and sponsor this bill. So we got Senate Leader Peter Worth, who is a Democrat who has served for many years. He was one of our major sponsors. And for leadership to sponsor anything is huge. And we had met with him multiple times. He was supportive. He said he would like go out of his way and speak to committee chairs and his colleagues about this issue, which again, for a leadership role in any chamber is huge because they already have a full stack of things that they have to deal with on a daily basis. And so for him to prioritize semi-open primaries was a game changer for us. Um, and then we also had sponsors who were very invested in this issue, who knew a lot about the issue, who could defend this bill on the floor and on their own without the expertise that we brought to the table. So, like, building that trust was very important. And then in the House, we had some more progressive Democrats that we really needed because, as you may know, people who tend to oppose things like this issue tend to be on the fringes of the parties. And so we wanted a, like I said, young, progressive facing coalition and sponsorship because we live in New Mexico, which is a Dem majority state. They're almost in a super majority. So we really needed as many Democrats as we could get on our side. And so we really needed to convince those progressive Democrats that were like, oh, I don't want people voting in my primary to come around. So we had great leadership from Representatives Cates, Parajon, and Rubio, who are all, from here. They get the issue. They work with diverse organizations, and so we really needed them to be champions of this bill, which they were. And then in terms of the coalition, we had Common Cause New Mexico, which for those listening out there, like tap into your local Common Cause organization. They're amazing. They have so much information and support, and they always need people to be involved. And then, like you said, Paul, we had NM Native Vote, which is the Indigenous serving organization. They do get out the vote every single year. And they came to us and said, hey, we keep hearing from our populations that people don't want to register with a party. There's already so much mistrust with the government. Why would they pick a party? And then they don't get to vote in the primaries. And majority of young Indigenous voters, 40% of them, are registered independent. And so this was a huge,
Wow.
important issue for them. And then, as I was mentioning, the New Mexico Asian Family Center, they also got data from their national partners saying that, like, they saw an increase in independent registration within the Asian American community as well. And that when they did get out the vote and, monitored polling locations where Asian Americans were voting in New Mexico, a lot of people were telling them, like, no, I don't want to party. I just want to vote. And so this became super important for them. And like I was saying earlier as well, we were probably the only bill that was able to mobilize a healthy group of young people, through the Young Democrats and the UNM College Democrats, which some of them were independent voters, but they just wanted to be part of a club. And so they joined the College Democrats group. Um, and they sent letters and made phone calls to legislators and talked to them for us. And so, and like they wrote op-eds for us and stuff like that. So it was amazing to see just the love and passion they had to be participating in the process. And then for opposition, there wasn't that much like organized effort against this. The sad part was that this has always been a bipartisan support, bipartisan opposition bill, but this year we lost a lot of our bipartisan support from the Republican side. Even though it still passed like on bipartisan lines, it wasn't as strong as we wanted it to be because the New Mexico Republican Party opposed this bill passionately this year. And they always have, but this year felt more strong than before, and they were constantly sending mailers. They were making phone calls to county clerks telling them to call elected officials to tell them to vote no on this bill, and threatening them to like primary them if they vote for this and stuff like that. So it got way out of hand, towards the end there, because towards the end they found out that we were actually going to pass this bill. So it was really sad to lose some of our like best supporters on the Republican side on our House vote. But at the end of the day, the bill passed, and we'll still continue building that trust and relationship with our elected officials, and, reassure them that, like, this is a good bill. This is not going to hurt anyone. Like, this isn't trying to raid anyone's party primary. Just, repeating the arguments that we've been since the beginning. Um, and then another group of opposition that I wasn't even expecting was a handful of campaign managers, reached out to some legislators, just questioning the bill and their support on it. And I was able to talk to a few of them and, give some ease to their minds about this bill. But that was also very interesting to see like who the players are that really cared about this change. And what I just continue to tell people is like, hey, you already reach out to independent voters in the general election as a campaign manager, as a candidate. So why not just do it a little bit earlier in the year in the primary? And then you'll just have even more support for the general because more people will be voting for your candidate. And so I think that helped a little bit, but I was not expecting to have campaign managers like
Yeah.
contacting an opposition. So that was very interesting.
Yeah, because that's not usually. I mean, they obviously do get involved to some extent in the legislative process, but not you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be to that degree. That's also kind of interesting, and this is purely a knee jerk from the outside looking in, considering that, as you mentioned before, it's a pretty decidedly Democratic state. What would have thought that Republicans might be a little bit more amenable to it because of their to the bill because of their disadvantaged state. But obviously, I'm not. You're obviously a lot more privy to more of the details than I am in that regard. But still, just from like a initial reaction, that is interesting. That a lot more of the opposition came on that side compared to Democrats. But there was still like a pretty decent Republican support of the bill then, or was that fairly muted?
In the Senate, yes, it was
Okay.
fairly more, you know, bipartisan. But in the House, we were expecting at least 10 votes from Republicans, which I believe there's 26 of them, and we only got 2.
Oh
And
wow.
that all flipped like in the moment on the floor as they were voting. And like you said, Paul, like there was a senator, her name is Senator Crystal Brantley. Her main argument on the floor, and she was a huge supporter of this bill, was what more do we have to lose as the Republican Party and as Republican candidates? Like, they're already in the minority, they don't have a single statewide elected official. What more did they have to lose? But because the party just put so much pressure on them to not support this, most of them didn't end up doing so.
Okay. Her name is one I do uh know about. I don't know about a whole lot about her, but hers is a name I am familiar with. Kind of made me think of uh this actually was something I had been involved a little bit with and you were talking about way back at the beginning about grad school and the internship I had to do in grad school. But long story short, we had some involvement in the U.S. Senate race in Massachusetts that year, and it was just odd to see the Republican. Whether again, I'm not saying whether I support or oppose any of this candidate's particular views, but the Republican candidate in Massachusetts was pretty starkly pro-Trump, which seemed like didn't seem like a very viable strategy in a very blue state like Massachusetts. But I guess it's that calculus of maybe something similar in New Mexico, where there's just something about their strategy. They think that this is the way to go about things. And in your case, going against your bill, you never know how some people uh, see a situation that even if they're not necessarily whether you agree with them on things or not, just sometimes even just the calculation of strategy sometimes can be just so starkly different. It can be interesting to see how people uh, regard that. So it's funny that you talked about this New Mexico state government being the land of manana. I think a lot of people who are involved in other state government processes could empathize, both Republican and Democrat. So did the process of this bill take just to clarify, did it take the entire legislative session to get it over the finish line? Because you did talk about how it required a lot of patience, or was it most of the session? Uh, Basically, just how long was the process for getting it over the finish line?
Paul, it was literally from day 1 to day 0. Like, it
Oh, there you
took
go.
the entire time, which is crazy because people will come up to you and say, "Hey, don't worry, I've passed bills in 4 days before." I'm like, "Literally how?" There's
Yeah,
no way.
yeah.
Because we pre-filed the bill. So the bill
Oh,
exists
okay.
before session even started. And then on the first day of session, you get assigned a bill number. And then from then you go on. So just for the listeners, we have two chambers. It's the House and the Senate. And in each chamber, depending on where you start the bill, which we started in the Senate, which is why it's Senate Bill 16. And we had two committees in each chamber. We already knew that. We worked with leadership to make sure that that was still the case. And our first hearing took 2 whole weeks to be
Oh,
scheduled.
wow.
And that's up to the chair's discretion. It's up to what other things they have going on as a committee. And like, as soon as we got out of that committee, it was quick. We got out of the Senate within the next, I want to say, week and a half. So, second Senate committee hearing, Senate floor hearing, we were out. And then it took a little bit longer to get our second House committee hearing. Our first House committee hearing was also pretty quick. As long as you're like read on the floor that day, you could be scheduled as early as that day if your committee meets in the afternoon. But our second committee hearing in the House also took about 2 whole weeks to just be scheduled. And then towards the end of session, you start getting into your late evenings because there's longer floor debates in the middle of the day. And so we got out of our last committee at 12:30 a.m. on like a Wednesday. And then we were just sitting and waiting for that to be scheduled on the House floor, and House floor leadership was supportive, but they don't schedule things unless they know you have the votes. So we had our own whip tracker. We gave it to the whip. She was supposed to like go and like reconfirm all the votes that we thought we had. And that was not possible until the bill was already on the floor and we were already being voted upon as they were whipping. And so it was just the most chaotic hour and a half of my life, just being on the House floor and seeing the big screen on the wall. It's like green and red, and it just constantly kept changing to green, red, green, red. And then
Oh,
it was
wow.
33 to 36 votes. That's how close we were.
Ooh, wow. Wow,
Yeah.
that is fascinating. I think the one of the things that people out, those of us who are not, or people who are not involved in politics like you or I think one of the things that people are least privy to is just how the political agenda works. Is all the ways. Sometimes there's just a lot of other pressing things that get put on the agenda, and sometimes people, if they really don't want a piece of legislation heard, but they feel that they're going to lose, they'll sometimes try whatever they can to get it pushed down the agenda, so there's just no time to hear it. Really, just fascinating and dirty. Just some of the ways that uh, people use to try to make something just not necessarily not just pass, but not even get heard. And you said that it's a pretty relatively short legislative session there. In Florida's actually is, well, it's going a little bit of overtime because it's they have state budget issues to work out, but usually the session would actually be ending today. But you just, again, just goes back to how does the political agenda work and how long legislative sessions are. Uh, but earlier talked a little bit about how I wanted to try to compare this to previous efforts that you had. And I was going to ask you if this was your first legislative bill that you were so closely involved with. We established that it's not. But with other times that you have tried to push this, or even not necessarily just open primary stuff, but any other legislation that you may have been involved in. But I guess maybe comparing it to other open primaries attempts might be a little bit easier to compare to. So what exactly was similar and different about the times you tried to push it then versus now? Besides the fact that obviously now you have more experience with it.
Yeah. I would say that previous years, we really didn't walk into the building with a strategy. We walked into the building with a bill and we said, we're just going to see how far it goes. And we really weren't allowed to be there for too long because we were a 501c3. So per IRS regulations, we had like very limited capacity for lobbying and money. And so this year we founded a 501c4, which is unlimited lobbying, and you can play in campaigns if you want to. So that enabled us so much more access to the roundhouse. I was there every single day from 8 to midnight sometimes. And so that was just a huge game changer because we had a strategy. We knew exactly what we needed to do because of the experience. And then we were able to be there every day because sometimes you don't know, and someone's in a committee that you really need to talk to, and you text them and they're like, okay, come here at 7:30 p.m. So it was so much easier for me to have direct access to the roundhouse to be like, okay, I'm gonna run and go talk to this person now. Whereas again, in previous years, we were like, here's a bill, we have a sponsor, let's go get him. Which is very, grassroots of us because that's how we were founded and how we started, and that's how any good idea starts. But if you are dedicated to getting it passed and done, you absolutely need a C4. You need funding for that C4. You need smart people to surround yourself with, like the lobbyists that we hired and the coalition that we built, and good sponsors that we were able to identify. And so I think that was just the hugest game changer. And then also, another issue that we supported this year was legislative modernization. We call it that, but it's basically creating an independent salary commission for our legislators because we are the only unsalaried legislature in the country. These people are there from their own time, spending their own money to be there, which makes it incredibly inaccessible for 99% of New Mexicans to run for office and to be elected and to serve. So that was another bill that we were supporting. It unfortunately died in its second committee, even though it passed its first committee unanimously. I was not as involved as I would have liked to be because our top priority was open primaries. And usually we had committees at the same time or we were lobbying at the same time. So I couldn't like double dip and help other people as much as I wanted to. And this effort was being run by the Common Cause of New Mexico, which doesn't have C4 funding, even though they do have a C4. So you can have staff there, but then you can't pay them to be there because C3 can't pay for C4 lobbying, you know? And so there was a lot of like limitations in that area as well. And I really think like pairing salaries with open primaries would make elections a little bit more competitive because more people could run for office now and more people would be voting. So like to me that's the best of both worlds where we would have better representative elected officials if we had salaries with open primaries. And I think, the downfalls of that was kind of what you were saying, Paul, with the back end politics, like behind the curtain stuff that we really don't see, because that bill tied in a committee, which means it's dead. Unless someone wasn't there, they come back and they are a yes vote, then they can bring the bill back. But they really wanted, like, to negotiate things. It was a Republican, and like they wanted different things from leadership, and leadership wasn't willing to budge on certain things. And so, but that one is an amendment, so that could be introduced whenever. And I'm really excited to work with Common Cause to see like what we can explore in that area. But yeah, it's a messy system.
Yeah, you just talked a but not to go too far off track, but you were talking about the fact that New Mexico legislators don't have a salary. I believe they have a per diem, right?
Yeah, they get $100 something a day.
Yeah, because I a previous episode of the podcast, like a couple months ago or something, I talked about full time versus part time legislators, and I'd known about New Mexico's before, but obviously doing more in depth research for that, I was just like, man, I can't believe they don't get paid like anything. And then you compare it to something like California and New York. They're the two states where the legislators get paid six figures, but they're also and have a much longer legislative session, but still just fascinating to see the how how much the 50 states can differ, and also the 401, or excuse me, 501s, C3 and C4. So really, thank you for all that bit of insight, not just for listeners, but I learned stuff plenty of times interviewing guests too. So it's really just fascinating to see all those differences. So now, moving past the endeavor that you just undertook and now looking towards the future, what do you see as the impact of this change for New Mexico primary systems being beyond the state's borders? Are you hoping more states follow suit in enacting the same kind of system, or at least just ending their closed primary status? Do you think it's going to have uh, a tidal wave effect, for lack of a better term? And are you going to have any involvement with those efforts, or are you mostly just focused on New Mexico and implementing other changes to the New Mexico system of politics?
Yeah, so we are definitely going to get into a very intensive, like I said, public education campaign to let the 300,000 people know that they can now vote. And being the only second state to do this through a legislature, I do hope that it lights like a beacon of hope for other states that have maybe tried ballot initiatives but not legislative processes before to give it a shot. I mean, on average, it takes a bill 10 years to pass, and literally, this is the 10th year that we have introduced this
Wow.
bill. So hopefully, it doesn't take people that long in other states because
Right.
of their previous like ballot initiative efforts. Um, but we really do hope that this give some form of hope to all the election reformers out there, because we know last year was pretty tough with the ballot initiative losses in 7 states. And but like the one big huge win was that Washington D.C. as a city passed ranked choice and open primary, so that was huge. Shout out to Lisa Rice. She led an amazing campaign, and she was actually one of my like icons in this field. If you haven't interviewed her, I highly recommend. She's amazing.
What's
And
her name again? Sorry.
Lisa Rice.
Lisa Rice. Okay. I'll definitely have to look her up then.
Yeah. And that gave me so much inspiration to say like we could do this too. And if we like build a good coalition, if we follow all the, steps that we need to, and lo and behold we did. And so if other states are interested, I would love to be as supportive as I can. I hope to, my future career 5 to 10 years from now to be able to work in this field nationally and help other states accomplish their goals and see like which form of primary is best fitting for their state and their state's needs. Like I was saying about my favorite form of open primary is any form of open primary. So I think that we could definitely learn from each other and build a lot, and hopefully more states will have open primaries. I know a majority of states have some form of open primary, but there's still too many states with closed primaries, and we can hopefully change that.
All right. Okay. Before we, uh, I think that's a nice segue into the final question about open primaries, and then one final question. Uh, besides that, any final thoughts you want to leave with us with about open primaries?
I guess my one final thought is the whole point of why we did this, why we've been doing this, and why we are extremely excited to continue working on this is so that people can vote, because this is a country that was built on democracy and people's rights, and any form of open primary just reinforces that. Parties are not included in the Constitution, but people are. And I think that we just need to go back and see that and figure out how we can continue building upon this win, which was huge, not just for us, but for our country, and get more people involved in the process and make voting more easier in a time when so many people are trying to make it more difficult. I think this just is so much more important now than it was before.
All right. Well, there's the mic drop on open primaries here. I think that'll certainly resonate with a lot of people there. So that is the end for the open primary segment. So now one final question. I like to, whenever I have a guest, I like to end on a random, fun, non-political question because it's not always about politics. I like to be well-rounded individuals here. And I think New Mexico would be a particularly good state for this because even though I've never been to New Mexico, I've been to, I told you a little bit earlier before we started, I have a little bit of family in Arizona, but the the beauty of the states in the Southwest is something I find very fascinating. So even though I have yet to visit New Mexico, maybe for whenever I do, uh, I've seen some pictures of some amazing landscape out there in that part of the country, and I just like delving into places history and just the physical beauty of it all. So what are give me 2 to 3 landmarks, parks, cities, whatever it is that you would recommend visitors to New Mexico to go over to, and I'll give a few for my state.
Okay, so for New Mexico, and this is extremely special to me because I just recently went there for the first time, is our Carlsbad Caverns in southern New
Oh
Mexico. It looks like it's another planet. Like it does not
yeah.
belong on the planet Earth. It is beautiful. It is just so magical, and I highly recommend hiking down and then taking the elevator up so you don't have to hike all the way back up because it is a bit of a walk.
Yeah.
But it's just gorgeous, and if you go during bat season, you can watch the bats like come out during sunset. I did not get to see the bats, but and then right around the corner from there is White Sands National Monument, and
Oh.
it is also just, again, otherworldly. It is miles and miles and miles of just white sand that looks like snow, and you can rent a little sled and go sledding, and you can have a little picnic. You can take beautiful sunset pictures there, and you can literally spend all day there and not know that you did that. And they're luckily close by each other, and right in the middle of them is probably one of my favorite barbecue spots in Cloudcroft, New Mexico. So highly, like, there's only one, so when you go there, you'll know which one.
Okay.
Um, so I mean, I'm a central kind of northern New Mexico girly, but I love southern New Mexico so much. There's amazing things to do, and the caverns have so much special like conspiracies and stories, and it used to be like underwater. Our state used to be underwater, but now we're one of the biggest deserts of this country, so
Oh
it's
wow.
really cool to see like all the fossils and stuff like that. But yeah,
Yeah, I like a good harmless conspiracy as long as people are not actually suffering any sort of injury from it. I like a good
absolutely.
harmless conspiracy, just how crazy some of it can get. Carlsbad just made me think of, even though it's not a cavern, if you ever make it to South Dakota, because my maternal grandfather is from there, it just kind of made me think of talk about otherworldly. Going to see the Badlands National Park at sunset is whether it, for any place I've been to or just seen pictures of, it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. But for my state, Florida, I will definitely, if you ever find yourself in this neck of the woods, obviously I'm a Tampa Bay area guy, so I'll vouch for the Tampa Bay area in general. But a really nice city to go to, and there's still a lot of Florida that I have yet to see. But I always recommend anybody to go to St. Augustine, which is the up in Northeast Florida. It is the longest. Trying to think of the specific term. It's the longest continuously settled or continuously lived in settlement founded by Europeans in the continent. So it is incredible to go see that. See the oldest street in North America. Just incredible stuff to go see. But there's all sorts of things to go see in Florida too. So, but whenever I make it to New Mexico, I will definitely go check out Carlsbad and the was it the White Rock National Monument? Which
White
call it?
sand.
White Sands, White Sands. Gotcha. So, hey, you make it out to New Mexico. For those of you listening at home, you definitely go ahead and check those places out. But that is going to wrap things up today for the Politics with Paul podcast. Once again, Sila, thank you so much for coming on to talk with us about all things open primaries. We'll see how this uh, if this starts to feed into other states. My state, Florida, is also a closed primary state, so we'll see maybe if it has some impact there on and in other states. And definitely stay tuned for all of that. So, once again, to all of you listening, thank you so much for listening. Oh, also links in the show notes: Facebook, LinkedIn, my Medium page, my self published book on Amazon actually talks a little bit about independents, why independents rarely win elections, and how they can become more competitive. Scylla, I almost forgot to ask you any other links that you want to share before we go.
If you're listening from New Mexico, visit nmvotersfirst.org to see how you can get involved and support us. We truly love everyone participating, and especially if you know independent voters in New Mexico, please send them our way. We would love to connect with them.
All right, well, there you go. Once again, everybody, thank you so much for watching and listening. And until next time, take care.